I'm going to share a screen here so that you can see what I put together for. Um, this is now, let's see, make it small. There we go. So this is kind of a flow chart for the Four Noble Truths. And the Buddha taught, as I'll explain coming up, that part of his awakening experience was in realizing these four truths, that some of them were beginning to be made known to him through his earlier practice with other teachers. It was primarily the fourth truth that became his own addition to this group of teachings. So we have the Four Noble Truths, and the first truth is the truth of dukkha. And the second truth is the origin of dukkha. The third, the extinction of dukkha. And the fourth, the path leading to the extinction of dukkha. So from each one of these truths, we can then kind of break them down into processes. And so the very first teaching that the Buddha gave after his awakening was the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And so he had this idea of envisioning the path of practice as a wheel. And so you would turn the wheel, and he described three turnings that one would do. One turn would be the engagement, the second turn would be the practice, and the third turn would be the understanding. Here we have four turnings. The first one, all in blue, is labeled the task, and it's in dotted line around. That's because this isn't really something the Buddha taught. This I borrowed from a Buddhist teacher. His name is Stephen Batchelor, and he, in one of his talks, created this sort of fourth turning, which is kind of the idea that in the turnings, we are going to set this task, which is to understand dukkha in all its forms. So as we look at the truth of dukkha, we're going to engage in it with this task in mind, that we want to understand dukkha in all its forms. So then the next turning would be to recognize what dukkha is. So in the recognizing, we say that, this is dukkha when we recognize what it is. Then the third turning, or in the traditional, would be the second turning. We are encouraged to understand dukkha. So in the second or third turning, we are working at getting ourselves encouraged. What do we do to keep ourselves motivated to understand dukkha? And then the third or fourth turning is the realization, so that the task to understand the dukkha is achieved and that dukkha is understood. One of the reasons Stephen Batchelor also started with a task is that it's a way to keep the engagement with the particular truth open. Because even with realization, it doesn't mean that we don't continue to task ourselves with understanding dukkha. There's not a time where we realize it and we're done. It's something to continue. So the task sort of keeps the engagement of the turnings continuing. then the second noble truth is, once we understand what dukkha is, then we can explore where dukkha comes from. And so the task here is to let go of the origin of dukkha, or to let go of the thing that makes dukkha arise. So the next turning would be to recognize that there is a way to give that we give rise to dukkha. We may not know what that is just yet. So our job is to recognize that we do things to make dukkha arise. And then we need to keep encouraging ourselves to put an end to the things, the origin of dukkha, the things that make dukkha arise. And then, if we're lucky, the last turning is that we understand the origin of dukkha. The third noble truth is that there's an end to dukkha, or that dukkha can be extinguished, or be the extinction of dukkha. So the task here is to experience the extinction of dukkha, so that we may actually be able to see the end of our experience of dukkha. So in order to do that, we recognize that it is possible to end dukkha and cultivate peace and joy. Then once we recognize, then we encourage ourselves to extinguish dukkha and cultivate peace and joy. Sometimes peace and joy is a result of extinguishing dukkha, but sometimes dukkha and peace and joy don't affect each other. And so this is an important part of understanding, because we oftentimes think that peace and joy and dukkha is mutually exclusive. And as we engage more, we start to see that they are interrelated, but one isn't the opposite of the other, that they can live together at the same time. And then, if we're lucky, at the end, we realize dukkha is extinguished and peace and joy is present. And then the last noble truth is the path that leads to the extinction of dukkha. And so the task is for us to practice the Eightfold Path. That the Eightfold Path is what the Buddha created to show us how to do the other three things. So we have to recognize that there is the Eightfold Path that helps us to end dukkha. And then we need to encourage ourselves to put the Eightfold Path to an end, and put the Eightfold Path to practice so that we can end dukkha. And the wording of that isn't so great. Then the last, hopefully, in the realization is that we realize that we are practicing the Eightfold Path. So that's basic foundational teaching that the Buddha created after his awakening experience. So tonight, we're just going to talk about the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha. And so to do that, I'm going to switch. And we will okay. So now we will understand. I just got to check and make sure. Okay. Make sure that nobody was trying to get in touch because they couldn't get in or something. All right, so the Four Noble Truths in the brackets here is the Sanskrit for the Four Noble Truths. This this part of the text comes from one of the early sutras that was written down in which the Buddha was teaching about the Four Noble Truths. And so it begins with, thus it has been said by the Buddha, the awakened one, it is through not understanding, not realizing four things that I, disciples, as well as you, had to wander so long through this round of rebirths. And what are these four things? They are the noble truth of dukkha, the noble truth of the origin of dukkha, the noble truth of the extinction of dukkha, the noble truth of the path that leads to the extinction of dukkha. As long as the absolutely true knowledge and insight as regards these Four Noble Truths was not quite clear in me, so long was I not sure whether I had won that supreme awakening, which is unsurpassed in all the world with its heavenly beings, evil spirits, and gods, amongst all the hosts of ascetics and priests, heavenly beings, and men. But as soon as the absolutely true knowledge and insight as regards these Four Noble Truths had become perfectly clear in me, there arose in me the assurance that I had won that supreme awakening unsurpassed. And I discovered that profound truth so difficult to perceive, difficult to understand, tranquilizing and sublime, which is not to be gained by mere reasoning and is visible only to the wise. The world, however, is given to pleasure, delighted with pleasures, enchanted with pleasure. Verily, such beings will hardly understand the law of conditionality, the dependent origination of everything, incomprehensible to them, will also be the end of all formations, the forsaking of every substratum of rebirth, the fading away of craving, detachment, extinction, nirvana. Yet there are beings whose eyes are only a little covered with dust. They will understand the truth. So the Buddha is talking here about how he came to understand the Four Noble Truths. And what's interesting, as we talked about in the Pure Land Sutra talks, Buddha was known as a special kind of Buddha because he was able to teach difficult concepts in a way that people understood. And there are Buddhas that are known for different qualities. The Buddha Siddhartha Gautama that lived on our earth had this unique ability to teach. And there's wonderful stories about how in one teaching, he could transform a person's mind so much so that they instantly wanted to become his disciple. Even assassins that were sent to kill him would become his disciples. And I always find those stories so funny because I'd love to see, the scene where the assassin comes in to kill the Buddha and the Buddha starts teaching the assassin, and the assassin's decides, okay, I got rid of my my career, I shaved my head, I wear the robes, and now I'm your student. And that happened all the time. And so that was a unique thing for the Buddha in comparison to other Buddhas that are talked about historically. So he's explaining that these aren't always easy things to understand, but he says that if your mind is only a little bit clouded, then you will be able to understand this truth pretty easily. And now he's going to spend the rest of his time in this talk trying to reach those of us who might be a little bit more cloudy, because he's going to explain some of these things in more detail. One of the things to be aware of as we go on is this idea of conditionality, what is oftentimes called the dependent origination. And the dependent origination, it's also called dependent arising, or the 12 links of dependent origination, is referring to the truth that all things arise in dependence upon multiple causes and conditions. And we'll be able to explore that in more depth further on. But just have in your mind the notion that everything that exists, everything that appears before us in the world, can only appear before us because of a myriad of other things that are also appearing in the world. And if you take one of those things away, then it's very likely that a whole bunch of other things are going to disappear, because the link that connects so many things is dependent on all the other things that are also appearing. And that'll become more important as we explore the second, or the third noble truth. So the first noble truth is the truth of dukkha. Now, some of you might be wondering, what is dukkha? I keep saying dukkha, 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 and I haven't explained it. There's a reason why I try to use dukkha only. Most of the time, the translation is suffering. But that's a problem, because what the Buddha included under dukkha were more than just suffering. There's a lot of things that can be considered dukkha. And I like the choice of that word. If you understand the Sanskrit meaning, dukkha means a broken axle. And so if we think about a broken axle and we put that in relation to the time that the Buddha taught, everything that was transported and moved from village to village, or even city center to city center, was pulled by cart. And so a lot of the use of the wheel was very important, which is also another reason why the Buddha used the wheel as a symbol for Buddhism. Because if you can imagine, you want to travel from your village to another village, maybe to sell some things that you made, and on the road between the two villages, the axle breaks. So now what you have to do is you're going to have to unload your cart, probably like on the side of the road, unload your cart, then try to see if you can repair the axle right there, but probably can't, which means you have to try to find somebody who can replace the axle for you and then repair it, and then load everything back up on the cart and continue on your way. That is really annoying, right? So dukkha, if we think of all the things that go into what we have to deal with a broken axle, then we get a better sense of what the Buddha was talking about when he used the word dukkha, because it's a whole bunch of stuff. Even in that example of the broken axle, there's first, okay, it's annoying because now we got to stop traveling. Then it's annoying because now we have to unload everything in order for us to be able to work on the cart. Then we have to try to figure out how to fix it. And if we can't fix it, then we got to find someone who can. And then, continuing like one annoyance after another starts to really paint a picture that suffering isn't enough. That's just part of it. There's so many other things. So the Buddha in his teaching is going to explain some of those things. So he says that first, birth is dukkha, decay is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Not to get what one desires is dukkha. In short, the 5 groups of existence are dukkha. And we'll explain what the 5 groups are briefly if we look down at the footnote. The 5 groups of existence are also known as the skandhas. And that's a Sanskrit word that means aggregates or collections or groups. And in this particular case, he's referring to the 5 aspects that constitute what it is to be a human being. And we'll explore those shortly. So why birth? Why is birth considered dukkha? The Buddha explains that the birth of beings belonging to this or that order of beings, their being born, their conception and springing into existence, the manifestation of the groups of existence, the arising of sense activity, all of those are what we call birth. So it's entering into this world of phenomenal experience. Then we have decay of beings belonging to this or that order of beings. They're getting older, becoming frail, getting wrinkled. All of the things that are involved with getting older are, lack of energy and the wearing out of our senses, some more than others. Some people have other things more than others, but all of that is the process of decay, or what we call aging. And that's considered dukkha. And I'm sure some of you, I know some are younger than others, but we can all relate to the difficulties that come when we begin to experience our own aging. And what is death? Death is the parting and vanishing of beings out of this or that order of beings, their destruction, disappearance, death, the completion of their life period, the dissolution of the groups of experience, the discarding of the body. This is what we call death. So that also is a form of dukkha. And all of us and all things in our world are subject to death. And what is sorrow? The sorrow arising through this or that loss of misfortune which one encounters, the worrying of oneself, the state of being alarmed, inward sorrow and outward woe. These are what we call sorrow. And what is lamentation? Through this or that loss or misfortune which befalls one is wail and lament. Wailing and lamenting the state of woe and lamentation. This is called lamentation. So all of the things that cause us to cry out, it could also not only just sadness, but it can also be in anger, in frustration. All of those are kinds of dukkha. And what is pain? Bodily pain, unpleasantness, the painful, unpleasant feeling produced by our bodies. This is called pain. And so pain is a form of dukkha. And what is grief? The mental pain and unpleasantness, the pain and unpleasant feeling produced by mental contact. This is called grief. And that is also a type of dukkha. And what is despair? Despair is distress and despair arising through this or that loss or misfortune which one encounters, distressfulness and desperation. This is called despair. And he continues with, and what is the dukkha of not getting what one desires? To being subject to birth, there comes the desire, oh, that we were not subject to birth. Oh, that no new birth was before us. So you have to understand that at the time of the Buddha, the prevailing belief, which was informed by the Vedic and Brahmanic religion was that every person was born in this life as part of a process of many incarnations in this world with the ultimate goal of perfecting oneself. And in the Vedic, the Brahmanic, and later would be the Hindu traditions, there was this idea that there's this one essential quality that you carried from one life to the next. And the goal was that with every incarnation, based on how you lived your life, you would want to be born at a higher level than the one before. If you did a lot of good things and cultivated yourself really well, then you would be more likely to be born at a higher level. If you did a lot of unpleasant things and bad things, then you would regress into a lower level. Now, this was the prevailing belief at the time. The Buddha was kind of a radical at the time because he changed the understanding from what was reincarnation, meaning that there's this essential part of you that exists and is always the same, always exists from one life to the next. The Buddha called what this continual process of being born, dying, and being born again in the world as a rebirth. And it seems at first that they're the same thing, but as we'll see later, it's a different thing that he's talking about. And the way that I've come to understand it is that we are like compost, so that we live our life and we accumulate all these different things. Maybe if we're lucky, we live a good life, and so our bodies and our minds and our consciousness is purified and is full of a lot of wholesome and positive qualities. And so then when we die, our bodies break down and our consciousness also breaks down into this bigger melting pot of substance, like a compost heap. And then when the next life begins to arise, all the different parts of that compost come together into the next living form. And so there's not one single essential thing that goes from one body to the next body, but a mix of all the things that are put into the bigger stew pot or compost heap. And I use compost heap because Thich Nhat Hanh likes to use the analogy that when we learn how to practice the Four Noble Truths, what we're learning to do is to turn the compost heap into a rose garden. And so we require the compost to make the roses grow. They feed off of the compost. And those roses that come out are made up of all the different parts that went into that compost. So there's, banana parts and tomato parts and zucchini parts and all that stuff in the compost heap. And then when the rose begins to grow, it takes some of the banana and some of the zucchini and some of the grass clippings and all that stuff, and it makes the rose. It's not the banana then turns into the rose. And so that's the subtle difference between what was the prevalent belief at the time when the Buddha was teaching to this subtle but very radical change in what he was teaching to the people out there. You can kind of think of Buddhism, which, by the way, was not called Buddhism at the time of the Buddha. It was kind of called the noble path, or the path of the awakened ones, the Bodhi path, which means awakening. It was more referred to in that sense because, for the most part, at that time, and for a lot of people to this day who practice Buddhism or practice Hinduism, Buddhism is sort of like a offshoot of Hinduism, a refined uh, sect of Hinduism, and kind of in a way that you might think of as Protestantism came from Catholicism. It's related, but it's quite different. And so Buddhism at the time was really thought of as a refinement of the Vedic tradition, or what was starting to become what we know of as Hinduism. So keeping that in mind, then when we talk about birth being a form of dukkha, it's because the being born in this world is kind of like a failure, in the sense that we haven't refined ourselves enough to escape the pain of being born in this world. And especially if you're coming from the reincarnation aspect, it really is a bummer, because we're trying to escape this kind of coming back here. The less times that we come back, that means the better we've cultivated ourselves. So, but then if we even don't really want to believe reincarnation and rebirth is something we want to explore, then we can also think in literal terms that birth is suffering, or it's difficult, it's painful, it's dukkha, because the mother goes through a lot of discomfort and pain. The baby goes through a traumatic experience and most likely pain. And so just arriving in this world is dukkha, setting aside anything to do with reincarnation or rebirth. And then we appear here, and as soon as we appear here, we are subject to decay. We are subject to disease. We are consigned to death. And we will experience sorrow, lamentation, pain, and grief and despair. There's no escaping those things in this world. So that's why birth is dukkha. And then he continues by saying, "Oh, that we were not subject to these things. And oh, that these things were not before us." But then the Buddha reminds us that even if we wish for that, our desire is not going to change the fact that those things are dukkha. You can say, "Oh, I'm never going to get sick because I don't want it. I don't want to be sick because it's unpleasant, so I'm not going to do it." And no amount of hoping and wishing is going to prevent that from happening, just like all of the other things that he's explained. So first, we have to understand that this is what we're dealt with. This is what we got to work with. So then he moves into this interesting teaching about the skandhas, or what we can call the 5 groups of existence, or the 5 heaps, sometimes it's called. Sometimes it's called the 5 aggregates. And so what are these 5 groups of existence? So we have corporality, which we can also think of as form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Now, all 5 of those things are what make it to be possible for us to have an experience as a human being. If you take one of those things away, we no longer can have a human being experience. We can't be a human being without a body. We can't function without sensation. We can't function without perception. We can't function without a mind, mental formation referring to being able to take what we perceive and then process it in our mind. And we can't function as a human being without consciousness. So we need all 5 of those things working together to function or to have what we call a human experience. And we would probably continue to say that any sentient being on our planet would require those 5 things in order to be have a experience in this world. So any corporal phenomenon, whether it's one's own or an external, whether it's gross or subtle, whether it's a high or a low experience, whether it's near to us or distant, all of those belong to the group of corporality, the group of form. And any sensation belongs to the group of sensation. Any perception belongs to the group of perception. Any mental formation belongs to the group of formations. And all consciousness belongs to the group of consciousness. So we'll explore what those are. So the first group, the corporality group of 4 elements. The body, the form of our body, the physical form, is made of 4 elements. And the way the Buddha presented it, it was solid, fluid, heating, and vibrating. We would probably think of them as earth, water, fire, and air. Which becomes clear when he explains. So the solid element is whether it's our own or an external, so that, like being someone else that you are engaging with. Theirs or your own solid element is our hair, our body, our nails, our teeth, our skin, our flesh, our sinews, our bones, marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, stomach, bowels, mesentery, excrement, or whatever of those dependent properties that we consider our body, that are hard and solid. That is the solid element, or the earth element. I guess I should explain the grouping, because this goes a little bit more into why the Buddha made this teaching distinguished from what was the predominant belief at the time. Because what the Buddha said, our so-called individual experience in reality is a process of our body and our mental functions interacting with each other. And so since the time began, things were happening in the world before we were born, and will continue to happen after we are born. And we are just part of this continual process. So in the 5 groups, or the skandhas, if we take them separately or combined, they in no way constitute any real personhood, which means that there's no personhood that exists apart from these things. And then the belief that we have this individual personhood is actually an illusion. And he uses the example of a chariot. So he says, a chariot has no existence apart from the axles, the wheels, the shaft, and so forth. Or as the word house is merely a convenient designation for various materials put together after a certain fashion, so as to enclose a portion of space, and there is no separate house entity in existence, in exactly the same way that which we call a being, or an individual, or a person, or by the name, is nothing but a changing combination of physical and psychical phenomenon and has no real existence in itself. That was a huge, radical diversion from the prevailing belief, because the prevailing belief was that there was an individual, separate personhood that existed independently of all those things. And that's what would continue in the next life. When the body fell apart, this one thing, they called it the Atman, this one thing would be continuing through its journey through the universe. The Buddha, he spent all this time, 6 years, trying to find the Atman, because that was all of what was being taught at the time. All of these practices, especially the really extreme ones, which he got involved with at the later end of his learning, where you hear about these swamis that would lay on beds of nails or spend the entire rest of their life standing on one foot, or some where they would never cut their fingernails. All of these strange bodily practices weren't just to be weird. They were actually to make the person become less conditioned by the body. And if they could divorce themselves entirely from the body, then they would find the Atman, that thing that exists in there. The Buddha found that the more he did those kind of practices, the more attached to his body he got, because all he would feel was the pain that his body was going through. And he didn't see anything emerging out of those practices that told him there was this, one quality that was sitting in there waiting for him to find. What he discovered was that quality was everywhere. It wasn't just in him, it was in everything. So his idea was that by trying to divorce yourself from the body to the point of almost death didn't help you find that quality. It actually made it harder, because you were trying to break apart the thing that allowed you to this experience in this world right now. And so this is why the teaching that he was offering was really a radical teaching. So what he would later call the anatman, the no self, that was his big teaching. So the other aspects of the four elements are what will be discussed in later Noble Truths, are the 24 corporal phenomena which depend on the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the touch of the body, and what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we can feel with our skin and our body. Also, the parts that are what we associate with male parts and feminine parts, the experience of the brain having thoughts, and our ability to communicate with our hands and our mouth. All of these are also parts that are related to the four elements. And there are different levels that they are broken down into. And some of that will be explained. But what makes the presentation that I've been working on here is that if you read a lot of Indian philosophy, there's a repetitive structure, because it's based on a lot of logic, but also because it was transmitted orally, there tends to be a lot of repetition so that we can keep, remembering what we're being presented. I tried to simplify a lot of that here so that there's still some repetition, but not nearly the amount that you would see in the actual sutra. Because for people who aren't really interested in the Indian method, it can become almost mind-numbing. And I didn't really want people to kind of tune out as they're reading it. So I've tried to keep it a little bit of that format, but not to the level that it can get to sometimes. So if we recognize what part of our body is made from the earth elements, then we can also explore what our bodies are made up of the fluid elements, which would be all of the stuff that we associate with liquid, water, the things that kind of, blood, bile, phlegm, even all of the pus and sweat, tears, all of those things are made up of the fluid element or the water element. And if we understand, when we look at what makes the earth element, what makes the fluid element, what makes the fire element, we recognize that each one of those things doesn't belong to you, and at the same time, it's not you. So our blood, it doesn't belong to us. We don't have ownership of it. It's part of what makes the body function. But we also don't go, oh, blood is who I am. I can get rid of everything else and keep my blood and it's me. We can't do that. None of those things, if we take them singly or together, we can't identify that we own any of those, or that we can identify those as who we are. So it goes through all of the different aspects. So with the heating element or fire element, we think of the energy of the digestion, the ability for the blood to be moved to the body and heat the body with the beating of the heart. All of those elements are related to the fire or the heating element. And then the vibrating element, or what we more commonly think of as the wind element, are the gases that are formed in our bodies, the breathing in and out of the air. All of those things are also part of the gas or wind or vibrating element. And just like all the others, the breath doesn't belong to you, and nor can you identify your breath as who you are. And the Buddha uses the example of, just as one calls hut the circumscribed space, which comes to be by means of wood, rushes, reeds, and clay, even so we call the body the circumscribed space that comes to be by means of bones, sinews, flesh, and skin. And then another really important teaching that the Buddha offered was the dependent origination of our consciousness. And so all of our sense organs are considered possessing of a consciousness. So he explains that with one's eye, if it functions, we can see the external forms, but we don't fall into a field of vision. It's not like as soon as our eyes see, we fall apart and we're just vision. Somehow our eyes stay in our body and it's able to perceive things visually and then take that information and process it in here. And so that ability for the organ to do that process is considered that organ's consciousness. And so he goes through and he explains for each of them that, you know, for the eye, the consciousness that arises depends on the eye and the forms, and we call that eye consciousness. And just like the ear, you know, corresponds with sound, and we call that ear consciousness. And continuing all the way down with all of our organs, including our brain. We have mind consciousness because the brain interacts with our experience either externally or internally, and then we have that experience and we call that the mind consciousness. All of those then break down into further processes so that we have feeling, we have sight, we have smell, we have taste, we have touch. All of those kind of things are all part of the physical experience, but are also dependent on the origination of those consciousnesses. So if someone had, someone was blind, we would say in this aspect that their eyes lack eye consciousness because they can't perceive the things and relate that information. If, you know, for 6 years I lost my sense of smell. So for those 6 years, I did not have nose consciousness. And so we look to those things as providing information for how we experience this world. Then this is another really important and unique teaching that the Buddha taught, which is the 3 characteristics of existence. He argued in this that our existence can only be possible with these 3 things appearing. 1, that all formations are transient, or in, you know, a lot of people might hear it be called impermanent. All formations are subject to dukkha, because as we explained, everything that appears here that lives is born, and it ages and it gets sick and eventually it dies. All of those different things, nothing escapes those things. And that all things are without a separate permanent self, the anatman. So for a lot of the people during the time that he was teaching this, they probably had no problem with understanding the first 2. The third one would have been pretty radical, because this is where he's saying that there is no unique, singular, permanent self that exists in each of us. We share this experience. Our bodies just kind of borrow part of it as we engage and live in this world. So he explains that corporality is transient, feeling is transient, perception is transient, mental formations are transient, and consciousness is transient. All of those things are constantly in the process of changing. You know, we're born as a little baby, and then we grow and we get bigger. So our body is changing shape and changing size. And then we get to a certain age and then we start shrinking again, right? And so we're always in this process. We feel something, we have an emotion. We don't have that emotion for the rest of our life. The emotion arises and then eventually it ends and a new emotion appears. Our perceptions, you know, they're always changing. We don't just see something and always see it for the rest of our lives. So all of these things are part of living in this world, and everything that lives in this world has this experience. And then all those things that have this transient experience are also subject to dukkha, because even the process, the experience of impermanence is dukkha itself, because there are times where we're having a great time. It's wonderful. We're so happy. And then suddenly it's over. And now we're disappointed because the happy time is gone. Um, or we're having a happy time and we know that at some point it's going to end. And so we experience dukkha because we're all worried about the happy time ending. And so we are conditioned by the very nature of the transient qualities of our experience to have dukkha. And because we experience the impermanence and the dukkha, we cannot say that this belongs to me, or this is what I am, or this is myself. Because how can we do that if everything's changing? Every part of our body, every part of our experience, every one of our thoughts, every one of our feelings, they're constantly changing. So how can we say that that is something that we can label as ourself? So then he explains that, wherever there is corporality or feelings or perceptions or mental formations or consciousness, whether it's our own or external, whether it's a big or a small experience, whether it's what we may think of as like an evolved or an advanced experience, or a low or a base experience, all of those things, we should understand that if we embrace true wisdom, in the Buddha's case, true wisdom being the understanding of how reality is, that none of those things belong to us, none of those things are who we are, and that is not a self. So he explains here, suppose a man who is not blind were to behold the many bubbles on the Ganges as they are driving along, and he should watch and carefully examine them. After examining them, they will appear to him empty and unreal and unsubstantial. These little bubbles just sort of are just there, and then there's nothing in them, and then they pop and they disappear. So in the same exact way, we should behold all of our physical experiences of our body, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental formations, and our consciousness, whether they're from the past, in the present, in the future, even near and far future. Because all of those things appear, they're empty of themselves, and then they disappear. And if that same person is watching carefully and examines carefully, then he will begin to realize that they appear to him without a permanent or separate self. So a bubble doesn't just appear out of thin air and exist for the end of time. It appears because the water is churning, and then it's hitting against rocks and the shoreline, and the wind is blowing, and all of that makes the water produce bubbles. And then the bubbles appear, and then whatever that was allowing them to form ceases to be, and then the bubbles break and they're gone. So there is no separate permanent self or existence in that, because it was only possible to appear because of things that were existing before, and it fell apart. And that's exactly what we experience. We're not just sort of, bink, here we are. I popped up into the world, and now I will exist in this form as it appears forever. The Buddha said, show me that, where that's ever happened. It doesn't. We're born because of the coming together of our parents, and then the body process feeds the fertilized egg, and I don't have to explain the process, I think you all know. So those causes and conditions are what allow us to be born here. And then our body keeps changing and growing and changing and growing, and then changing and shrinking and changing and shrinking until all the processes that allow the body to exist fall apart. And then there's not like this little thing left on the ground going, oh, this is what I was, existing in all those changing forms. No, it disappears. It goes back to what everything else is, connected to. And that is what continues to be the Buddha's teaching throughout the rest of his life, and demonstrating how he came to realize that truth through the teachings over and over. And he explains, in this verse, which there's a collection of poems that the Buddha wrote. It's mostly consensus that he wrote these verses, and they relate to the teachings. So this comes from, I believe, on old age, his verse about old age. And he says, how can you find delight and mirth where there is burning without end? In deepest darkness you are wrapped. Why do you not seek for the light? Look at this puppet here, well rigged, a heap of many sores piled up, diseased and full of greediness, unstable and impermanent. Devoured by old age is this frame, a prey of sickness weak and frail. To pieces breaks this putrid body. All life must truly end in death. So for some, they might think, wow, the Buddha's kind of a bummer. He keeps talking about that, everything we experience in life is subject to impermanence and dukkha, and we don't even have something unique inside of ourselves that only I can have. We have to share it with everybody else. And then, he talks about, we got to be aware that we're going to die. We got to know that we're going to die, and we got to know that our body's going to get old, and we have to know that our body's going to get sick. And some people might take all that and go, Buddhism's really depressing. And that's a mistake. And the reason why that's a mistake will be explored in the rest of the Four Noble Truths, because what we discover after we get to understand the truth of dukkha and how it arises, then we start to be able to set aside some of the things and put our attention on cultivating other things that make the experience in our life wonderful and like a miracle. And that's what will be outlined in the future of beginning next week. So the last important thing that should be understood is this term called samsara. And it can also be considered the wheel of existence or the cycle of birth and death. And it's another kind of new take on what the predominant belief system was at the time, which was reincarnation. And the reincarnation was very structured and ordered and hierarchical. So, if you were experiencing a really difficult life, it meant that you did a lot of bad things in your previous life, and now you're paying the price for it. And if you're having a really wonderful life, then it means that you've done a lot of good things and you're reaping the benefits. And in some ways, the teaching of reincarnation was helpful because if you were having a really difficult life and you tried really hard to do the best you could in your life, then you had this glimmer of hope as you died that the next life was just going to be a little better. But unfortunately, it became much more complicated than that. And it really became a way of uh, reasserting a lot of what we call the caste system in Indian society, where there were people who were very low and other people who were very high. And it could take thousands of years for the person at the lowest level to reach the next level. Like countless lifetimes to just get slightly ahead of where they were. And so the Buddha wasn't subject to that because he lived outside of that culture. He came from a tribal culture that were probably a lot more like maybe we would think of as uh, the Mongols in the steppes area, where they were family tribes that lived and interacted with each other. And then within those tribes, there might be one leader who kind of organized the family tribes. And that's where the Buddha came from. His father was the chief of the Shakya clan. And so he was the leader of a bunch of family tribes. And they didn't have a belief in a caste system. They didn't think that there was, someone was just inherently higher than another person. So when the Buddha began teaching and was encountering this, he was very critical of this system because it seemed a bit more controlled by the people who were at the higher level than any kind of natural order. And so he was constantly trying to kind of poke holes in that belief. And instead, what he focused more on was, what can you do in your life to affect your life now? If you can change your life now, then you're already going to change the outcome of any future life or any future physical experience, because you're contributing to that positive stuff into that compost heap that will help make all life, all things that emerge from it, that much better. So he explains in that with Samsara, I'll read the way he wrote it, was that inconceivable is the beginning of the samsara. We can't conceive of when this whole process started. No one is ever going to be able to discover the very beginning of what it was to be alive. And certainly anyone who's obstructed by ignorance or who's caught by craving or hurrying and trying to get through all of their lives are going to understand the origin. And he says, what do you think is more? The flood of tears which weeping and wailing you have shed upon this long way, hurrying and hastening through this rounds of rebirths, united with the undesired, separated from the desiring of this, or the waters of the four oceans. And he says, for a long time you have suffered the death of a father and a mother, death of sons, of daughters, of brothers and sisters. And while you were experiencing this dukkha, you have shed more tears upon the earth than there is water in the four oceans. So he's saying, we have had so many experiences, it is impossible for us to calculate. It's more than what we could even conceive of as all the water on earth. And so he continues through that comparison, taking like these huge amounts of human experience or sentient life experience and comparing it to something that is in this world and saying that the thing that's in this world is way more less that's kind of a weird phrase, way less than all of that collected experience that you in these physical forms have experienced in some way or another. And the other thing about samsara is that it's a the life cycle that happens within the birth and death is a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of what it is to be part of this whole process. So few of us can even conceptualize how infinitesimally small our life is in comparison to all of the process of things coming together and falling apart have happened before we even appeared here. And again, it's not, all of this isn't to bum you out and make you feel like, I'm just a nothing. It's actually, he's doing all this to set us up for this really, really wonderful understanding that comes when we first have to look at what it is that we experience in this world, that everybody experiences in some form and another. Some experience more of one than others, and then another person experiences more of a different one. But we all are born here. We all experience the impermanence of a life. We all experience the dukkha that is part of living a life. And we all, if we really are able to look carefully, we all start to see that there isn't any one thing that we can attach to our experience that says that that is who I am. And so that's the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha. So next week, we'll explore the truth of the origin of dukkha, which is kind of the beginning of the good news. He's not going to make us wait until the very end. We'll start to see now that once we recognize, it's kind of like, I like to think of the Buddha as kind of a scientist, and sometimes he's related as kind of a doctor. And so first what he did was he recognized that there was a problem, like an illness. And then he studied really hard, looked at the situation and identified what the illness was. And then from there, was able to then diagnose, okay, I know what the illness is, I know where it comes from, and I know that I can put an end to it, and here's the medicine that we can apply that will put an end to it. And so this is the process that we'll begin to see, and that'll be more apparent next week when we talk about the origin, how dukkha appears in the first place, and what we do to make it appear. Because there are a lot of things we do that create the dukkha, even though we think we are just sort of hapless victims. A lot of times the difficulties that we experience, we've created ourselves. And so we'll get a better understanding of that. And that's important, because if we don't understand what it is, and we don't understand where it comes from, then there's no possible way that we can accurately or effectively put an end to it. And so that's the setup. So before we end the talk tonight, does anybody have any questions?
The word that you used, not.
Oh, anatman.
How do you spell it?
It's it's ANATMAN. T-M-A-N. So
T.
A-N-A-T-M-A-N.
Oh, M-E-N.
So the original word is Atman, that means self.
Okay.
And in India, when you, to negate something, you put the A in front. And so that's the negation. And so anatman means no self or non-self. Just like with him, ahimsa, himsa is the word for harm. Ahimsa is the word for non-harm. So you know when you see words, um, I don't know the breakdown, but I'm assuming nicha or nicha, uh, it means probably stable or permanent, and anicca would mean impermanent or transient. Uh, so that's kind of a little bit. You've studied a little bit of Latin, so a lot. Latin was based off of Sanskrit, so there might be similar rules you might notice.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Is anybody bummed out?
No.
Good. Good. Um, Next week it'll be a little bit more brighter. So, but first we have to know all the bummers so that we know how to deal with them. So today was the bummer week. Next week, a little bit more uh, hopefulness, I guess. Any other questions?
Is this it, what you're reading is what you have written?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
it's not. I can't like take all of the credit because it's from the Buddha's writing. I'm using some writing from Paul Carew, who wrote a lot of translations in the mid to late 1800s. And that's where I got the idea to do a book like this, because he took the the different teachings that he translated and he put them into a form like a Bible, because he thought that might be the way to be able to teach it in the West, because in the West was primarily Judeo-Christian religion, and the Bible was a big component of transmitting the teachings. And so he put together this book. So I kind of borrowed the idea from him, and I've used some of his language and layout, but I'm kind of updating it a little bit and changing some of the things, because his focus was on Theravadan Buddhism, which is really focused on just awakening. And I'm putting in a little bit more Zen uh, aspects, which, that's an important part. Awakening is important, but, Zen is kind of about waking up to the life you have right now, and making that life your practice. And so I've been working now, this is my third year, I'm almost done, working on putting this book together that hopefully can be more enjoyable and helpful to Western readers who want to learn and use the teachings as a spiritual development practice or tool.
I can't wait till it's published so we can all have a copy.
Yeah, and if you go to our Sangha, you'll probably be using it.
We probably will, yeah, in Sunday school.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I'll have to get little pictures to go in them too.
That's right.
I always liked my Bible when I was a kid with the color plates, that had
Yeah.
like scenes.
Yes.
I would, try to find in the Bible where the pictures were, you know, described. And I always thought that, like, that was what you're supposed to do with the pictures.
And then you can make all the little cards that the Catholicism has for the saints.
Right, for all the bodhisattvas.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sitting in and learning a little bit about the first noble truth. Is Tuesday evening a good evening for you all? Because I can make it next Tuesday as well. So then we can continue with the second noble truth next Tuesday at 7. But I'll send a reminder out.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a great night, everyone.
You too.